In 1876, a mining surveyor passing through Deadwood, Dakota Territory, walked into a parlor house and sat down at a table set with cloth napkins and a hot meal. He had not eaten properly in 11 days. He wrote about it in his journal, not about the women, but about the food. Number 17 was served across Nevada and Kansas and never appeared on a single written menu. Number 9 fed women who had nothing left but each other. These 25 meals were the hidden economy of the frontier. Hit that subscribe button. Number 17 used an ingredient that every saloon in the territory discarded each morning without consideration. Number 15 was made by women in San Antonio who cooked in the open air and fed half the city before anyone thought to write their names down. Number 9 was not a recipe. It was something that passed between women in kitchens before the day began, when there were no customers in the building at all. These 25 meals were not accidents. They were the economy, the currency, and the survival strategy of the most erased chapter in American food history. The count begins. Number 25. Venison stew with cornbread. On the Great Plains in the 1870s, venison was not a delicacy. It was available to anyone who could shoot. In parlor houses along the cattle trails, deer meat came through the back door, traded by hunters for a warm meal or a bed for the night. The cook simmered it slow with wild onion and whatever root vegetables had been kept through the week. Cornbread went in last, soaked up the broth, and stretched the meal across a full table. Out east, people were paying prices for beef. Out here, nobody was performing prosperity they did not have. Number 24. Prairie chicken fricassee. Before the cattle boom stripped the grasslands bare, the prairie chicken was so common across Kansas and Nebraska that settlers treated it as background noise, always there, never particularly valued. The cooks in frontier parlor houses knew otherwise. They jointed the birds, browned them in whatever fat was on hand, and braised them slow until the meat fell from the bone. The result resembled the kind of dish served in city restaurants, assembled from a bird that cost nothing but the shot. By the 1880s, prairie chicken populations had collapsed. The meal disappeared with them. Number 23. Sourdough biscuits with gravy. The sourdough starter was one of the most guarded possessions on the American frontier. Trail cooks carried theirs in canvas sacks close to their bodies through the night to keep the culture alive. Parlor house cooks maintained their starters the same way passed from woman to woman, kept through dry seasons and hard winters. The biscuits went into the oven before dawn. The gravy was made from whatever drippings remained in the pan. Flour thickened it. Salt set it. It was the meal that started every day, regardless of what the night before had asked of anyone in that building. Number 22. Pickled eggs with whiskey. Every saloon counter in the American West had a jar of pickled eggs sitting beside the bottles. They were cheap to make and they lasted without refrigeration. A practical necessity in towns where ice was expensive and summer heat was brutal. In parlor houses with attached bars, these eggs were part of the house economy. Kept in brine, served alongside a pour of whiskey, offered to men who had just arrived after days on a cattle drive. Protein and alcohol in the same transaction. The jar was always full. The jar was never fully empty. That was the point. Number 21. Buffalo tongue stew. Before the mass slaughter of the 1870s and 1880s reduced the great herds to near nothing, the buffalo tongue was the premium cut. Hunters took the tongue and the hide and left everything else on the ground. In the higher-end parlor houses of frontier cities, buffalo tongue appeared on the table as a marker of standing, evidence that the establishment had access to the best the territory offered. It braised long, seasoned with whatever spices the supply wagons had carried west. The men who ate it had likely passed a stripped carcass on the open plain that same afternoon, left by hunters who took only what the market valued. Number 20. Bean soup with salt pork. This was the foundation, the provision that kept people alive when everything else ran out. Salt pork and dried beans traveled without spoiling, which made them the most reliable food supply for chuck wagon cooks crossing hundreds of miles of open territory. In the smaller parlor houses, the rougher ones at the frontier edge, this was the meal on hard weeks. The beans soaked overnight. The salt pork went in at dawn. By evening it was done, and it was enough. No one called it a specialty. It did not need a name. It simply needed to exist. The record of what parlor houses actually served was almost entirely removed from the American historical account. Every Western film produced in the last 100 years delivered the same image: the saloon, the gunfight, the dance hall girl in a feathered dress for 30 seconds. Before the hero walked back out into the street, Hollywood spent decades constructing that version of the frontier because it was clean and it sold tickets. What it removed entirely was the economic reality of what parlor houses actually were in the American West. A high-end parlor house in Denver or San Francisco was not a back-alley operation. It was a structured business. Mattie Silks, who ran one of Denver's most prominent establishments from the 1870s onward, operated in a city that tolerated and taxed that economy openly. The food in those houses was not incidental. It was part of the draw. Men with money expected a full table, and the women who ran these establishments understood that a good meal kept a customer in the building longer than almost anything else could. The same city that had a church on one corner had a parlor house on the other. Both served meals. Only one of them made it into the history books. That is not an accident. That is a decision someone made about whose story was worth keeping. Number 19. Calf Brain Scramble. In the cattle-slaughtering towns, Ebenleen, Wichita, places where beef was processed and shipped east, the offal was what stayed behind. The premium cuts moved on the rail cars. What remained was the liver, the kidney, the brain. Calf brain scrambled with eggs in a skillet over an open fire and eaten before the day's work began. In parlor houses near the stockyards, it was a kitchen staple, cheap enough to buy in quantity, dense in fat and protein, ready in minutes. No one advertised it. No one needed to. Everyone who lived near a slaughterhouse already knew exactly what it was. Number 18. Tamales. Along the Texas borderlands and into the Southwest, Mexican cooking had fed the region for generations. Before American settlers arrived and renamed everything in sight, the women who prepared food in frontier establishments near the border knew masa, knew lard, knew the patient process of steaming corn husks over low heat for hours. Tamales traveled well. They held through a cold night. They could be made in quantity and kept. The men who ate them and had never encountered a tamale before called them unusual. They finished every one on the table. Number 17. Pickled watermelon rind. When watermelons came through in summer, carried by wagon across parched land from wherever they had been grown, nothing was discarded. The flesh went to the table. The rind went into the brine jar. Salt, vinegar, sugar if there was any, sealed in a crock and left to work. Weeks later, the rind had become something sharp and bright, a condiment that gave plain food a second dimension, that made a meal of one ingredient register as two. Zero waste was not a philosophy on the frontier. It was arithmetic. It was the only calculation that mattered. Number 16. Oyster stew. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, it altered what was possible to eat. In the American West, within months, canned oysters packed on the East Coast and shipped cross-country appeared on frontier store shelves almost immediately. In the higher-end parlor houses of frontier cities, oyster stew became the signal dish. It announced that this establishment had access to provisions the surrounding territory did not. The preparation was simple: cream, butter, canned oysters, a little salt. The message it delivered was not simple at all. It said, "This establishment is not what you assumed when you rode in." Number 15. Chili con carne. In San Antonio in the 1880s, the women known as the Chili Queens set up their cook stands in the city's public plazas each evening and sold bowls of chili to anyone who passed. Beef, dried chiles, and spices, cooked until the whole thing became something deeper than its ingredients. Some of these women worked in the city's informal economies in more than one way. The chili they made fed cowboys, soldiers, laborers, and merchants without distinction. Years later, researchers examined the nutritional composition of the dish and found it more complete than most of the convenience food that replaced it. At the time, it was just supper. Number 14. Dried fruit pudding. Dried apples and prunes were among the few things that traveled hundreds of miles in a supply wagon without spoiling. They were small, dense with sweetness, and they kept. The chuckwagon cook soaked them overnight and simmered them the next day into a thick mass that served as dessert, a word that had almost no practical meaning on the frontier, but one that people reached for anyway, because sweetness was rare and therefore retained in memory. In parlor houses, far from any orchard, a bowl of dried fruit pudding was the closest available approximation of something gentle. It was the kind of thing that people recalled long after more substantial meals had faded from mind. Number 13. Prickly pear jam on hardtack. Hardtack was the soldiers' ration, flour and water pressed into dense crackers and baked, until they could survive months in a field pack without deteriorating. After the Civil War, military surplus hardtack moved through the West in large quantities. Native communities across the Southwest had used the prickly pear cactus as food and medicine for centuries. Before settlement arrived, settlers learned to process the deep red fruit into a thick, sweet jam, produced from something that grew free in terrain where almost nothing else did. Hardtack with prickly pear jam was two survival systems from two entirely different worlds, placed on the same plate without ceremony. Number 12. Fried salt pork with molasses. Salt pork was the universal constant. It appeared on every supply list, in every chuck wagon, in every frontier kitchen that had anything at all to work with. Sliced, thin, and fried until the fat rendered out, it was the base of dozens of other dishes and a complete meal on its own. Molasses was the sweetener that traveled when refined sugar could not. Thick, dark, slow pouring, and cheap. The combination kept people moving through 14-hour workdays in mines and stockyards across the territory. Fat, salt, sweetness. Three things the body required. One plate to deliver all three. Number 11. Venison jerky stew. The technique of drying meat to preserve it had been practiced by native communities across North America, long before European settlement. Settlers learned it, adapted it, and built their winter food supply around it. Venison jerky could be stored for months without refrigeration. In lean seasons, when fresh game was scarce and supply wagons had not arrived, the cook added dried jerky to a pot of water with whatever root vegetables were on hand, and held the heat low until the meat softened and the broth thickened around it. It tasted of smoke and salt and the particular patience of people who had learned not to expect anything to arrive when it was due. Number 10. Sourdough pancakes with sorghum syrup. A sourdough starter maintained from the gold rush years and kept alive through decades of frontier life was worth more than most of what a cook owned outright. Women passed starters to each other the way they passed other essential provisions, without ceremony, with complete understanding of what was being transferred. The pancakes were thick and slightly sour. Sorghum syrup, grown in the South and shipped west for decades before maple syrup became widely available, was heavier and more bitter at the edge, darker than anything put on a pancake today. A person who ate this on a winter morning in a frontier kitchen carried the smell of it for the rest of their life. The kitchen record is the section of frontier history that has been most consistently set aside. The women who cooked these meals were not working from printed recipes. They had no cookbooks. What they had was accumulated practical knowledge, which ingredients survived long transport, which ones held through seasonal variation, which combinations could sustain a person through the kind of physical labor that most Americans today do not encounter across an entire working life. That knowledge did not originate from one culture or one tradition. It arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. Chinese railroad workers who built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad brought fermentation methods and techniques for preserving vegetables in brine. Mexican vaquero traditions contributed chiles, masa, and the practice of open-fire cooking that European methods had not developed along the same lines. Native foodways had already cataloged every edible element in the western landscape before any settler arrived to name it. The European women who traveled west carried bread traditions, curing methods, and sourdough cultures. Across the Atlantic and then across the continent, in parlor-house kitchens on the frontier, all of that arrived at the same table. No one named it fusion. The term did not exist yet, but the food that came out of those kitchens was more layered, more nutritionally varied, and more culturally complex than most of what was being served in the established restaurants of eastern cities that regarded everything west of the Mississippi River with considerable condescension. The women who cooked it held no formal training and no credentials. They possessed knowledge that the broader culinary establishment required another century to arrive at independently. Number 9. Laudanum tea with crackers. Laudanum tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol was sold without prescription across the United States throughout the 19th century. It appeared in general stores, advertised in newspapers as a remedy for pain and sleeplessness. In frontier parlor houses, it was present in nearly every building. Some women used it to manage genuine physical pain produced by the conditions of their work. Some were administered it by the people who operated the establishments. Some kept a small bottle the way they kept every small provision that made the night pass more quickly. It was taken dissolved in hot tea, usually with crackers alongside, because the stomach required something solid. Laudanum remained legal until 1914. By then, an entire generation of women had grown old in its company. Number 8. Hobo stew. At the end of the month, when money had run short and the supply order had not come in, the cook gathered everything remaining in the house and put it in the pot. The heel of a salt pork slab, half a tin of beans, a few dried vegetables, whatever broth had been set aside during the prior week. There was no recipe for this. There was only what remained. The pot went on the fire and cooked until everything in it had released what it contained. The women who ate it assigned it no name. Naming it would have required acknowledging what the month had been. So they ate. Number 7. Sweet potato pie. Many of the women who worked in frontier parlor houses had traveled west from the South. Among black women in particular, the food they brought with them was the clearest connection back to everything they had left behind. Sweet potato pie required almost nothing. Sweet potatoes, eggs, butter, a little spice, a simple crust. It was the food of family tables in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, and it appeared in frontier kitchens wherever those women went, made in whatever conditions were available, with whatever substitutions were necessary. It was not nostalgia. It was identity maintained through the repeated act of cooking, continued until the result tasted exactly the way it was supposed to. Number 6. Hardtack pudding. The same cracker that had kept Civil War soldiers barely alive in the field was now surplus, moving through the West in quantity after the war ended. A cook who understood the material soaked hardtack overnight in water or whatever milk was on hand, mashed it soft, added dried fruit and a small amount of sweetener, and baked it until it set into something that resembled pudding. The way a preliminary sketch resembles a finished painting. It was not equivalent, but it was dessert produced from a military ration necessity, wearing the thinnest available covering of something almost pleasant. Number 5. Corn dodgers with fatback. Corn dodgers were small, dense cornmeal patties shaped by hand, cooked in a dry skillet or directly on a flat stone over heat. The technique had traveled through Appalachian and Southern foodways for generations, adapted from Native American corn preparation methods that had sustained the continent long before settlement towns existed to be built upon it. Fatback, the cut of salted pork from the back of the animal, composed almost entirely of fat fried in the same pan alongside them. The fat absorbed into the cornmeal. The dodgers held their shape. 2 ingredients. Nothing else. The kind of meal that required only that a person sit down. Number 4. Canned tomato soup with crackers. After canning technology expanded through the 1870s and 1880s, canned tomatoes became the most accessible, non-perishable item in the American West. They arrived by rail in cases and stocked every general store from Kansas to California. Opened over heat, thinned with a small amount of water, and salted, that was the soup. Crackers went alongside it or were crumbled directly into the bowl. In the rougher parlor houses, this was the meal set before women on days when the economics of the establishment did not allow for anything more. A tin of tomatoes, a sleeve of crackers. Some days, that constituted the full account. Number 3. Chicken feet broth. The feet were what the butcher left behind. After the breast, the thighs, and the wings had been claimed, the feet accumulated and went to whoever would take them, generally for nothing. A cook who understood the material placed them in cold water, brought the pot to a slow boil, and held it there for hours. What came out was a broth dense enough to hold its shape when it cooled, saturated with gelatin, deeply savory, the kind of liquid that set in a bowl like pale amber. Nobody was analyzing its composition. They were drinking it because it produced, for a short time, the physical sensation of sufficiency in conditions that offered very little of it. Number 2. The bread and lard sandwich. 2 slices of bread. A scrape of lard. Nothing else. Before Crisco arrived in 1911 and redirected American kitchens toward vegetable shortening, lard was the cooking fat in every household that could not reach butter. In frontier parlor houses at the lean end of the month, bread and lard was what remained when everything else was exhausted. The bread was cut thick when there was enough flour to permit it. The lard was spread thin because there was never quite enough of anything. Nobody sat down to this with ease. Nobody spoke while they ate it. But they sat down to it, and the next day started. Number 1. Before the first customer arrived, before the house came awake to whatever the day required of it, there was an hour, sometimes less, that belonged to no one but the women in the kitchen. In parlor houses from Deadwood to Tombstone, this was when the cook put cornmeal mush on the fire, or set a skillet of whatever was available over the heat. And the women who lived there sat together, not serving, not performing any function for anyone else, just eating. It happened in hundreds of establishments across the American West and was not entered into any ledger or letter that survived. It carried no name. It required none. Every meal on this list fed someone. This is the only one produced purely, entirely, and without any exchange for the women themselves. It is the only meal among 25 that no one tried to claim from them. These meals were never only about food. The women who cooked and ate in parlor houses across the American West have been reduced by the historical record to background figures, props in a mythology assembled around other people's stories. The kitchen, however, is where the honest account survives when nothing else does. What a person prepares to feed themselves and others, with whom they share the table, and what they use when almost nothing remains. These constitute the most accurate document of a life that the historical record can produce. This week, locate one meal from your family's past that no one wrote down, a dish someone prepared when the pantry was nearly empty, or when money was short, or when the situation called for something drawn from memory rather than a written recipe. Cook it. Sit at a table, not a couch. A table. Eat it without rushing. Leave a comment below, identifying what it was and who first placed it in front of you. That knowledge belongs to all of us. The frontier never disappeared. It simply stopped being documented.